What started as just another subway ride for Jason Statham turned into a moment the entire world would soon be talking about. You won't believe what happened next, or how it changed everything. Stay with us until the end, because this story will leave you speechless. And hey, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support means everything. Let us know where you're watching from down in the comments. Jason Statham sat quietly on a worn plastic seat, his baseball cap pulled low, a simple hoodie masking his recognizable face. The subway rattled beneath him, the rhythmic clatter of the tracks drowning out the low murmur of tired passengers. No cameras. No flashing lights. No eager fans pushing in for autographs. For the first time in months, he was just another commuter. And for a brief moment, he savored that feeling. The air was thick with the scent of metal, old leather, and the faint, stale reminder of fast food long abandoned under a seat. Jason leaned back, letting the steady motion of the train lull him into a rare sense of peace. No directors barking orders. No endless press junkets. No paparazzi capturing his every move. Just him. Anonymous. But that fleeting calm wouldn't last. At the next station, the subway lurched to a stop, and a wave of passengers flooded in. Among them was a young man in a gray hoodie, his face hidden under the shadow of his pulled-up hood. His eyes, sharp, restless, darted around the car, scanning. Jason recognized that energy instantly. He'd seen it before. Unsettled. Twitchy. Looking for something, someone, to provoke. Then, the young man locked onto his target. An elderly black woman, maybe in her late 60s or 70s, shuffled inside, clutching a heavy, overstuffed handbag. Her movements were slow, cautious, her worn shoes scraping softly against the floor as she searched for a seat. No one offered her one. Jason felt irritation rise in his chest as she glanced around, hope flickering in her tired eyes. But no one met her gaze. She sighed, disappointed. Jason shifted, about to stand and offer his seat, but then the young man stepped forward. For a second, Jason thought he was going to help her. He was wrong. "Move it, Grandma," the young man sneered, his voice laced with venom. He stepped in front of her, blocking her path. Her eyes widened in surprise, confusion flashing across her face. She tried to move around him, but he shifted again, cutting her off. "I said move," he barked, shoving her lightly with his shoulder. She stumbled, gripping the metal pole for support. Gasps rippled through the car. A few passengers glanced up, eyes flickering with uncertainty. Jason's fingers twitched under his hoodie, his instinct screaming at him to stand, but he didn't. Not yet. The young man let out a chuckle, glancing around as if expecting applause. A few passengers smirked. A man sitting across from Jason shook his head in amusement. Others quickly looked away, pretending they hadn't seen anything. "Look at this old bag," the young man scoffed, turning to the crowd like a comedian delivering a punchline. He nudged the woman's handbag with his foot, dragging her whole house around in this ugly bag. "What you got in there, Grandma? Rocks?" A few nervous chuckles. Phones appeared. People started recording. Jason's jaw tightened. His fists clenched. The woman said nothing. Just clutched her bag tighter and tried, once again, to walk past him. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor. But he wasn't done. He stepped in front of her again, his grin widening. "Where you think you're going, huh?" he taunted. "You deaf, Grandma? I'm talking to you." Then, he shoved her, harder this time. She lurched forward, slamming into the pole. Her handbag slipped from her grip, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. Jason shot up. Instinct. No hesitation. Then, he stopped. He sat back down. His heart pounded in his chest. His jaw locked. He wasn't watching to see if anyone else would step up. He knew what was about to happen. The woman bent down, hands trembling as she reached for her bag. The young man leaned down too, only to yank it from her grip, holding it high above her head like a trophy. Her face crumpled in shock. "Give that back," she cried, her voice breaking. "That's mine. Please." He smirked, shaking the bag tauntingly. "Oh, now you got something to say, huh? Too late, Grandma. Should have spoken up sooner." She reached again. He yanked it away, laughing. The few recording passengers held their phones up, their faces blank. Some chuckled. Others turned away, pretending nothing was happening. A businessman in a suit pulled his newspaper higher, blocking out the scene entirely. No one moved. No one said a word. And that's when Jason stood up. What started as a normal subway ride for Jason Statham turned into a moment the entire world would soon be talking about. You won't believe what happened next and how it changed everything. Stay with us until the end, because this story will leave you speechless. And hey, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support means everything. Let us know where you're watching from down in the comments. Jason Statham sat still, jaw clenched so hard it ached. His body screamed at him to move, to do something, but he waited. And with every passing second, a sickening feeling settled in, not at the young man causing trouble, not at the passengers who watched in silence, but at himself. He had waited, hoping someone, anyone, would step up and do the right thing. They didn't. They wouldn't. This time, when Jason stood up, he didn't sit back down. With slow, deliberate steps, he moved toward the young man. No one noticed him at first, too caught up in the spectacle. The guy swung the stolen handbag like it was a trophy. The old woman reached for it again, desperation in her eyes, but he shoved her back with his free hand. Jason's patience snapped. "That's enough." His voice cut through the noise, low and sharp as a blade. The young man spun around, his smug expression shifting to confusion. "What did you just say, old man?" He tilted his head, sizing Jason up. "Who you think you are?" Jason exhaled slowly. Then, with one simple movement, he pulled back his hoodie just enough for his face to be seen. The young man's smirk wavered. Recognition flickered in his eyes. "Give it back." Jason's voice was calm. Too calm. The subway car fell silent. Phones lowered. Faces shifted from amusement to realization. "Ah, you ain't serious," the young man muttered, his bravado slipping. He glanced around for backup, but even the passengers who had laughed earlier now avoided eye contact. Jason took a step forward. "Last chance. Put it down." The guy hesitated. Looked around. No one was backing him up. Even the man with the smirk from earlier turned his gaze to the floor. All right, the young man mumbled, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Chill, man. It was just a joke." He crouched down, setting the bag on the floor. Jason didn't move. "Apologize." The guy scoffed. "Man, come on, I just..." "Apologize." Jason's tone didn't change, but the weight of that single word made the entire car hold its breath. The young man swallowed. His hands twitched at his sides. He turned to the old woman, shifting uncomfortably. "Sorry," he muttered. Jason's stare didn't waver. Louder. The guy's nostrils flared. His jaw tensed. He glanced at Jason, then at the expectant faces around him. "I said I'm sorry, all right," he snapped. Jason took another step forward. "Now get on the ground." A pause. A thick, suffocating silence filled the train. The young man blinked. "What?" "Face down. Hands behind your head." His face paled. He looked around again, searching for an escape. But there was none. Jason hadn't laid a hand on him, hadn't raised his voice, but the weight of his presence alone was suffocating. Slowly, reluctantly, the young man lowered himself to the floor. His hands moved behind his head. Jason towered over him, his breathing steady, his body poised like a coiled spring, ready for any sudden movement. The old woman clutched her bag, her lips trembling. She whispered, "Thank you." Jason didn't respond. He just gave her a single, firm nod, his eyes never leaving the guy on the ground. From the back of the car, someone whispered, "Is that Jason Statham?" A man's voice broke through the silence. "Someone call the police." No one moved. Jason's eyes swept across the passengers. "Call them." Still, hesitation. His voice dropped, sharper this time. "I said, call them." This time, hands fumbled for phones. The energy in the subway had completely shifted. The same people who had laughed before now sat frozen. The ones who had ignored the situation suddenly looked invested. The subway doors slammed shut with a metallic clang, sealing them off from the outside world. The train lurched forward, the familiar rumble filling the narrow car, but now, the atmosphere was different. Jason remained standing, his gaze fixed on the young man lying on the dirty subway floor. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared to move. And in that silence, a hard truth settled over the train. One person had changed the entire moment. Because sometimes, all it takes is one. What started as just another subway ride for Jason Statham turned into a moment the entire world would soon be talking about. You won't believe what happened next, or how it changed everything. Stay with us until the end, because this story will leave you speechless. And hey, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support means everything. Let us know where you're watching from down in the comments. A man in a suit at the far end of the subway car cleared his throat, still tapping on his phone. Yeah, I called," he muttered without making eye contact. "They said they're on the way." Jason gave him a single nod. Then his attention shifted back to the young man. "You hear that?" Jason said, his voice calm but heavy. "They're on their way. You better think real hard about what you're gonna say when they get here." The young man scoffed, his tone dripping with defiance. "Man, I ain't doing nothing. She dropped her bag, that's all. Y'all overreacting." Jason crouched slowly, controlled, measured, until he was eye level with the young man. His piercing gaze was unrelenting. "Don't lie to me." His voice barely above a whisper, but it sliced through the thick air like a blade. "I saw everything. Everyone here saw everything. The only thing you should be thinking about now is how you're gonna make this right." The young man didn't answer. His eyes darted around the car, scanning for sympathy. But there was none. The same people who had laughed at the old woman now avoided his gaze, suddenly finding interest in their phones, the floor, the windows, anywhere but at him. Jason let the silence stretch, letting the weight of his words settle. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he stood back up, never breaking eye contact. The subway rumbled beneath them, but inside the car, the silence was suffocating. Minutes passed. Each second dragged like an eternity. Jason's eyes stayed locked onto his target, unblinking, unwavering. He didn't need to say anything more. His presence alone was enough. Then, finally, the intercom crackled to life. "Next stop, Grand View Station. Please stand clear of the doors." Jason glanced at the old woman. Her eyes met his for the first time since it all began. In that shared look, there was something unspoken. A quiet understanding. A gratitude that didn't need words. She wiped at her eyes with a tissue, her hand still trembling. Jason gave her a short nod. For the first time, she smiled. Faint, but there. The train slowed, brakes screeching. The young man on the floor stiffened. His breathing turned shallow, erratic. His eyes darted to the doors, calculating. Jason saw it before he even moved. "Don't." His voice was razor sharp. A warning. A final one. The young man froze like a deer in headlights. His hands twitched, but he didn't dare make a move. The train came to a full stop. The doors hissed open. A few passengers glanced toward the exit, debating whether to leave or stay. Two people stood, stepping off quickly, their eyes locked forward, pretending none of this was happening. Jason didn't look away from the young man. "Stay seated." His voice was calm, firm, a command. A man hesitated near the exit, then slowly sat back down. Another pulled out his phone, pretending to scroll, but Jason saw his fingers shaking. Then, in the distance, police sirens. Faint at first, growing louder. The young man's breath quickened. His fingers twitched. He was still weighing his options. Jason's voice dropped to something almost inhumanly cold. "Don't do it." The young man flinched like he'd been struck. The siren screamed now, filling the tunnel. Then, flashes of blue and red flickered through the subway windows. The train slowed again. The tension in the car reached a boiling point. "Grand Central Station," the intercom announced. "Stand clear of the doors." Jason didn't move. The train jolted as it came to a stop. Passengers braced themselves. Then, heavy footsteps. 4 uniformed police officers stepped into the car. Their presence shifted the energy immediately. Sharp eyes scanned the scene, locking onto the man on the floor. The lead officer, a tall man with a buzz cut, stepped forward. "What's going on here?" Jason didn't flinch. He didn't even hesitate. He nodded toward the young man. "This one tried to rob that woman," he said, gesturing toward the old woman. She sat up a little straighter. "Shoved her. Snatched her bag. Tried to run." Jason's voice was calm, matter of fact. The officers exchanged glances, then moved in. The young man swallowed hard. His bravado was gone now. For the first time since it started, he looked small. And Jason Statham just stood there, watching. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person to stand up. And when that happens, everything changes. What started as a routine subway ride for Jason Statham quickly turned into a moment the entire world would soon be talking about. You won't believe what happened next, or how it changed everything. Stay with us until the end, because this story will leave you speechless. And hey, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support means everything. Let us know where you're watching from down in the comments. A uniformed officer stepped forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "All right. On your feet," he barked at the young man. "Man, I didn't do nothing." The young man protested, his voice laced with desperation. But the officer wasn't interested in excuses. He grabbed him by the arm and yanked him to his feet. "I didn't do nothing." She dropped it. "Tell it to the judge," the officer snapped, twisting the young man's arms behind his back. The metallic clink of the cuffs echoed through the car like a final verdict. Jason watched as they hauled him off the train. A collective exhale rippled through the passengers, whispers buzzing through the car. Relief. Shock. The old woman wiped a tear from her cheek. Her eyes locked onto Jason. "Thank you," she said softly. Jason gave her a small nod. He didn't need to say anything. The message was clear. The subway doors slid shut. The rumble of the tracks returned, a steady rhythm beneath the uneasy silence. Jason sat back down, his heart steady, but his mind distant. The old woman smiled faintly at him once more before looking away. The train rolled forward into the tunnel, but inside, the weight of everything that had just happened still hung heavy in the air. The underground tunnels blurred past the subway windows, but the atmosphere inside the car had shifted. Jason sat near the end of the carriage, staring straight ahead, though his thoughts were still locked on the events that had unfolded just minutes before. Across from him, the old woman sat quietly, gripping her bag like it might be ripped away again at any moment. Her fingers twitched now and then, small, involuntary movements that told Jason the fear hadn't fully left her. The passengers who had laughed, cheered, or simply watched in silence now looked different. Shame weighed on them. No one made eye contact. No one spoke. Heads were buried in phones. Eyes fixed on windows, watching the darkness outside whip past like a fast-forwarded film reel. Anything to avoid looking at each other. Jason noticed everything. At the last station, the police had taken the young man in cuffs, but the weight of their presence still lingered. Jason glanced at the old woman. She hadn't said much since she thanked him. Her eyes darted around, scanning the train like she was waiting for something else to go wrong. He knew that feeling. The way trouble never really felt gone. "You all right?" Jason asked, his voice low but firm enough to cut through the noise of the train. The old woman blinked, as if he had pulled her out of a deep thought. Her eyes met his. And for the first time, she didn't look afraid. "I'm fine, baby," she said, offering a weak smile. Her voice was soft, but steady. "I've been through worse." She adjusted her bag on her lap, patting it gently, like a mother soothing a child. "But I appreciate you for what you did back there. Most folks would have just watched." Jason nodded. His eyes flicked to the other passengers, the ones still pretending they hadn't seen a thing. "Yeah. I noticed," he muttered, his jaw tightening. "People are real brave, until it's time to be." The old woman let out a dry chuckle, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ain't that the truth?" she said, shaking her head. Her eyes lingered on him a moment longer, studying him, trying to place something. Then, she tilted her head slightly. "You look familiar. I've seen you before." Jason leaned back, pulling the brim of his cap lower over his face. "Just got one of those faces," he said casually, looking away. She chuckled again, shaking her head. "MHM. If you say so." Minutes passed in relative quiet. The sound of metal grinding against metal filled the space, broken only by the robotic announcement of the next station. But then, Jason felt it. A shift. A stare. Near the front of the car, a man squinted at him. Studying. Trying to connect the dots. Jason ignored him. Kept his eyes forward. The man pulled out his phone. Swiped. Scrolled. Then looked back at Jason. And then, his eyes widened. "Yo!" The man muttered under his breath. His gaze flicked between Jason and his phone. Jason exhaled through his nose. He knew what was coming. The man leaned forward slightly, his excitement barely contained. "Yo, wait a second. Is that Jason Statham?" His voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. Heads turned. Whispers followed. People leaned forward, their eyes wide. Hands slowly reaching for their phones. The same people who had sat in silence moments ago were now buzzing with energy, like bees in a broken hive. "Is that really him?" a teenage girl whispered to her friend, phone already halfway up. "Holy SH, that's Jason Statham," someone else mumbled, lowering their headphones for a better look. Jason sighed. His face hardened. He'd been here before. Too many times to count. It always started the same way. A whisper. A glance. Then the phones. The pictures. The attention. Once it started, it didn't stop. He turned to the man who had spoken first, fixing him with a cold, sharp look. The man's excitement died mid-sentence. He froze. Jason didn't have to say a word. The message was clear. The man's grin faltered, the confidence in his face draining as quickly as it had appeared. He had just made a mistake. Jason didn't have to say a word, his eyes did all the talking. Cold, sharp, unwavering. The air in the subway car grew heavier as the man hesitated, his bravado cracking under the weight of that silent stare. But then, as if grasping for control of the moment, he forced a smirk back onto his face and lifted his phone higher. "Yo, Jason, man, can I get a pic?" he asked, his tone lighter now, almost playful, as if the tension from seconds ago had never existed. Before Jason could answer, others caught on. A ripple effect. Cameras were raised. Fingers hovered over record buttons. The sudden shift in energy was palpable. Come on, bro, just one photo. Jason didn't move right away. He let the moment stretch, let the weight of his silence settle over them. Then, with deliberate, measured slowness, he shook his head. Not today. His voice was quiet, steady. But there was no room for negotiation. The man holding the phone hesitated. Then, like a child caught misbehaving, he lowered his arm, his shoulders sagging under the unspoken reprimand. But not everyone took the hint. A teenage girl, sitting just a few feet away, thought she could get away with it. She lifted her phone, her hand steady, and pressed the shutter button. Click. The sound was small, almost insignificant, but in the charged silence of the subway car, it might as well have been a gunshot. Jason's head snapped toward her, his gaze locking onto hers like a predator spotting movement in the brush. She gasped, her breath hitching. Her face turned bright red, and in a panic motion, she yanked her phone down to her lap, as if she could undo what had just happened. From across the car, the old woman had been watching everything. A slow, knowing smile crept across her lips as she leaned forward. I knew it, she murmured, amusement laced in her voice. Jason turned to her, his expression softening for the first time that day. I knew I'd seen you before, she continued, her grin widening. Jason Statham, huh? Well, I'll be. Jason exhaled through his nose, a quiet chuckle escaping before he tapped the brim of his cap. Don't blow my cover, he said, voice low. The old woman winked. Your secret's safe with me, baby. The intercom crackled to life, cutting through the moment. Next stop, Midway Junction. Doors will open on the right. The train began to slow, the force pushing passengers slightly forward in their seats. Some reached for their bags, preparing to step off. Jason kept his eyes down, knowing the moment wasn't over. He could feel it, the lingering stares, the hushed whispers. The shift in energy. He wasn't wrong. Yo, I'm putting this on TikTok, someone muttered near the back of the car. Jason closed his eyes, and inhaled deeply through his nose. Of course, they would. It didn't matter what he had done. Didn't matter that he had stepped up when no one else did. To them, it wasn't about right or wrong. It was about content. Views. Shares. Likes. The train screeched to a halt. The doors slid open with a mechanical hiss. A few people shuffled out, some glancing back at Jason before disappearing onto the platform. But one man hesitated. He lingered just long enough to raise his phone, snap a picture, and dart out before Jason could react. Jason's jaw tightened. His fingers curled against his knees. The old woman had seen it too. She studied him for a moment before leaning in slightly, her voice low but full of something deeper than just words. Don't mind them, baby, she said. Jason looked at her, brow furrowed. She smiled, slow and knowing. They only see the flash, not the fight. Jason exhaled, his tension ebbing slightly. She was right. You did the right thing, she added, voice firm. Doesn't matter who sees it. The doors slid shut. The subway rattled forward, deeper into the tunnel. Jason sat back, letting her words settle in his chest. For the first time since this all started, he felt lighter. Then, his phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket and glanced at the screen. A notification flashed across the display. You're trending, bro. Jason Statham stops robbery in subway. He stared at it. Then another popped up. Statham, hero in real life. And another. Watch Jason Statham handle thug on subway, goes viral. Jason sighed. Locked the phone. Slid it back into his pocket. Leaned back in his seat. No cameras. No flashes. No noise. Just the steady hum of the subway tracks beneath him. But he already knew it was too late. Somewhere, his face was on a screen. Somewhere, someone was sharing it. And by the time he reached his stop, the whole world would be watching.